We are now in a situation where we can pick and choose. We need to use everything that we have at our disposal.
When do you smell the inflection to take place?
When people realize that we don't have any more time to lose.
Nicola de Blasio. Nicola is a senior fellow at Harvard at the Belfer Center for Energy.
More transparency, more accountability, more real-time usage.
Yes.
Are you in the camp that believes that that's going to happen?
Yes and no. People forget that it's called the energy transition because it's going to be a transition. It's not going to happen overnight. And there are going to be costs associated with this transition.
At the rate that China is going to, invest on AI, I just can't see how coal is going to disappear in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
So, first one, you really don't want a private company to decide policies for you. Second, we also need to remember that there are hundreds of millions of people around the world that do not have access to electricity.
Absolutely.
And it would not be fair to expect that they pay for the CO2 emissions that other people we have done.
Hi friends, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for being with us ever since we started Endgame some years ago. The conversations have been invariably elevating and animating. At least from my personal point of view, it's been a tremendously rewarding experience. And I'm hopeful that you could be further supportive of us by way of clicking on the subscribe button, watching every episode as much as possible, if not as fully as possible, and also joining us as a member of the Endgame channel. I can only promise you that whatever we're going to be doing going forward, we'll try to make Endgame a better experience for all of you. Thank you. Hi, friends. Today we're honored to have Nicola de Blasio, who is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard University. Nicola, a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
I usually start off with a personal question on how you grew up, where you grew up, and how you ended up becoming intellectually curious about what you profess today. Tell us.
So, I grew up in Italy, in Milan. How I got involved in energy, it's actually funny story. I did part of my high school in the US, and one of the classes that I loved the most was chemistry, which unlike what it would have been in Italy, that would have been just classroom, was basically in the labs, and I really liked it. And when I went back to Italy after graduating, I basically started at the Politecnico of Milan, and chemistry, they had chemical engineering, which is one of the degrees was in chemical engineering, as I said, and I thought it was something that I would have wanted to do. Little I knew that at the time, I think about 99% of us graduating from the Politecnico of Milan in chemical engineering would end up working at ENI. And so I in the end, even if I was doing my thesis and everything, I ended up at ENI. And I was at ENI for about almost 18, 20 years. And I had an interesting career because I started as a process engineer in the gas and refining department. And then my boss at the time became CTO of ENI. And I moved to the economic feasibility department. ENI sent me around basically the world for 6 months to learn about economics. So they did an incredible job in training me. And then things evolved, and I was lucky to end up being vice president in charge of R&D development around the world. So I was working with other major energy companies, but I was also managing university relations and the startup corporate venture arms of the company. And then I got married to an American, and here I am.
You spent time at MIT.
Yes.
You nurtured quite a number of ventures with MIT, and then you came over here to the Belfer Center. How early was it, during your time at NE, that you detected the importance of renewables?
So, what for some people is counterintuitive is the fact that big energy companies or oil and gas companies at the time, they have always been looking at the future of technology, because these companies, they want to be in business for the next 100 years or more. And so within all of the incumbents, there are groups that look into the future. And it's one of the best jobs that you can have. And so it became clear, because it was about, if you think, it was about in 2000. 2000, renewables were still expensive, but they were starting to be deployed in an increasing percentage. And traditionally, especially the Europeans, but I would say also the American, oil and gas companies were oil and gas companies. And at one point, there was a transition where they started to look into electricity. And then the step, and obviously the logic there was, we sell energy, we don't sell just oil and gas. And then the moment you start to look at electricity, looking at renewables becomes an easy step. One of the reasons why there was, from a business point of view, I think there was this transition, is that a lot of the majors in Europe were actually selling natural gas retail. And so then, you want to add the electricity because you can increase your market share and your revenues. And so then, as I said, renewables, and if you to this you add the fact that there are entire groups within this company that look at the future and how technology will impact the energy system of the future. That's why things are evolving the way they are.
If you talk to a hydrocarbon company, the large ones, there was an observation, or there's a sense that they may not be allocating enough resources for renewables. Is that a misplaced perception, or is it warranted by the fact that technologically it's just not as easy as it might sound?
I need to be careful how I phrase this. So I think that there is if you look at it from a pure economic point of view, today, the returns that you make on oil and gas are much higher than the returns you make on renewables. So, especially in Europe, there was a transition where the incumbents, the majors, were national champions. They're still owned by the local governments, but they were national champions. And the goal of this, the mission of these companies was to provide energy securities for the countries. Then this changed again before 2000, where it was more about growing as a business and providing returns to the shareholders. So the challenge that and I'm not trying to make a judgment here. I'm just stating what I see. The challenge that the CEOs of this company have is the fact that they have to, because they're for-profit companies, they have to basically guarantee returns also to their own governments, not only to public and private shareholders, but to the governments as well. And they have to invest in renewables at the same time. And it's interesting to see how there are two different groups of shareholders, in my opinion. The ones that are willing to accept lower returns for the overall good or for driving renewable adoption, and the ones that don't. They just care about the economic returns. And so it's difficult for these companies to match these two trends. And so I think that the reason is that right now, because we don't factor into oil and gas returns the externalities like CO2 emissions or climate change, returns are higher, and so there's still a significant percentage of shareholders that are pushing for higher returns more than for addressing something that might be perceived as a longer term issue. What you see, which is interesting, is that now a new trend is developing within majors where they're starting to spin off the let's say the renewable part of the companies because of what I said before, because there is this feeling that certain shareholders will be happy to have lower returns but driving the transition to a low carbon economy with respect to others. And so the way we're trying to avoid these two trends to clash is basically to spin off companies that either do renewables or do oil and gas.
I took a look at the one of the publications of Wood Mackenzie. It's well into the future. If you take a look at the forward demand for fossil coming from the aviation, it's not declining. Demand for petrochemicals, it's not declining. For automotives, it will continue to decline, which, gives a sense that demand for oil overall is not going to decline, right? Well into the future. Is that the right way to think about it? I mean, today, the world is consuming around 100 million barrels of oil per day. Is that number likely to stabilize or increase or decrease in the next 10 to 20 years? Just to give, the broad brush stroke.
Oh, we moved from peak oil to peak oil demand.
Right.
It's not an easy question because, when we think about the issue that you raised, we also need to remember that there are hundreds of millions of people around the world that do not have access to electricity. And the truth is that, we need to bring these people out of energy poverty and poverty in general. And it would not be fair to expect that they pay for the CO2 emissions that other people we have done. So there will be a need to, if we don't want to keep relying on fossil fuels, there will be a need for Western countries to provide financing and technology to the global South so that we can bring these people out of energy and poverty in general, and do so in an environmental sustainable way. Have I answered your question?
Yeah. So it sounds like it's not likely to decline anytime soon, right? And I'm with you on how the global North ought to behave going forward, and how the global South ought to behave going forward. But, I come from the global South. I don't think it's constructive for the global South to just keep blaming the environmental legacy of the global North. I think we got to be a lot more constructive than that by way of investing in the necessary building blocks so that we can be a lot more environmentally friendly, right?
But the global north needs to help.
Absolutely. So the follow-up would be then, if you want everybody on the planet to understand the narrative of sustainability, everybody, particularly those from the global south or the developing economies, need to modernize. Because I think to understand and be able to embrace the narrative of sustainability, one needs to be modern thinking, right? And unfortunately, that represents about 80 to 85% of the population of the planet, the developing world. And they only care about putting food on the table, irrespective of how the energy comes from.
Everyone would. Anyone would.
Yeah. So, and you take a look at the purchasing power of the typical developing economy, it's no more than 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Whereas all these great technological options that are renewable in nature can only be availed at a cost at the least at 15 cents per kilowatt. So how do you reconcile these?
I'll make a comment and give you an example. People forget that it's called the energy transition because it's going to be a transition. It's not going to happen overnight. And there are going to be costs associated with this transition. And they need to be allocated, this cost, in a just and sustainable way for all. If we think about what happened in Europe when the war in Ukraine started, the EU was pushing for the transition, but again, a lot of people had forgotten or were not considering that it was a transition. Countries were against nuclear and then had to go back to coal. And then when the war started, basically because energy system, especially the ones that are developed from the bottom up, so starting as regional and then they grow, like in the case of natural gas, the countries had never addressed how to make this system the most effective and efficient way at system level. Every country has been going on their own. And so when the war in Ukraine started, the prices of gas, natural gas in Europe tripled in a very short time. And I remember seeing the gas bill of my mother, 3 times more expensive in a month. It was a lot. And so governments started to have to put the billions of euros in deficit into basically subsidizing fossil fuels. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that we should really try to avoid replicating this inefficiency and mistakes every time, because if this conversation would have happened before, having a more system level analysis in mind, we could have used that money in much better ways than ended up being used. And until we don't have these conversations where how technology is going to be key to accelerate the transition, how countries need to work together in order to have a global energy system that are actually working, we are going to spend an awful lot of money, to waste an awful lot of money, instead of putting it to a productive use.
Special thanks to the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School for providing support for this episode. Check out links in the description to know more about research, ideas, and leadership programs for a more peaceful world.
Why did you choose hydrogen of all the optionalities out there?
So it was a choice, and in part a first choice, because when I started before all the hype that we're having now, and so then when he exploded, I didn't have a choice. But having said this, the thing that I love about hydrogen. It's that for someone like me that has worked his entire career in energy, and I've been lucky to have been able to do this around the world, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to be involved in the design and deployment of new energy system at scale, because we haven't done this for the past 100 years. And hydrogen is offering this opportunity as the beauty that it touches every single sector in the energy value chains. Now, it won't be the best choice for every single sector. So I think that we will have to have a mix of technologies, and every single technology will have its use, its preferred use or optimal use in different sectors. But hydrogen touches every single sector. So from an intellectual point of view, but also for the hope of accelerating the transition, it's the best topic to be in at the moment.
Talk about this more, in the sense that, the Japanese are very passionate, seem more keen about hydrogen. And it's been very difficult for lay people like me to understand why, for example, the Toyotas of the world, they didn't want to jump on this bandwagon of electrifying, vehicles as quickly as one might think they could have, right? Or as quickly as the other, enterprises. Why is there some magic that the average people are not aware of about hydrogen?
No, I think that let me take a step back. We have had hypes about hydrogen in the past. The latest one was in 2000, and it faded away. Why? For two reasons mainly. The first one, because at the time, people were talking about using hydrogen basically for mobility in the light duty sector, so in passenger cars. And already in 2000, development and deployment cycles for battery electric vehicles were much farther down the innovation cycle than hydrogen. So hydrogen could not really compete. Governments were moving incentives from the vehicles and the batteries themselves to the infrastructure. The second reason why at the time it faded away was because in 2000 renewables were still very expensive. So the reason why we're talking about hydrogen today is due to the success of another technology, renewables. When the price of renewables started to drastically drop, penetration of renewables in the grid started to drastically increase. Right. The problem is that the grid that we have today, and I say the grid, but if we think about the US doesn't have a grid. It's a patchwork of different systems that often don't even talk with each other.
Right.
The grid, as it was traditionally built around the world, was built around centralized power plants. And so it's difficult for this system to integrate a higher penetration of renewables, which are intermittent. And so then you have issues of curtailment. You have an issue that, they're intermittent. So you have a challenge to meet supply and demand at the right level throughout the day. And so hydrogen started to be, and again, hydrogen has been a staple, even if we don't have hydrogen markets. So it's not a commodity, it's a staple. Hydrogen has been in the energy systems and in the petrochemical ones for 150 years, refining, upgrading of heavy oils and fertilizer. So hydrogen is now seen as an opportunity to store energy
A lot easier.
A lot easier because, on a mobile phone, if you leave it on your desk for too long, the battery will die. Once you produce hydrogen, you can store it. You will have the cost of storing the hydrogen, but ideally you can keep it there forever. And so when you had an increase of renewables and you had curtailment issues and didn't know what to do with the electricity, hydrogen has a value proposition. So in the short term, you could think about substituting gray hydrogen. So today, most of the hydrogen that is produced around the world, which is about 75 million tons per year, it's produced from fossil fuels. So you still have CO2 emission associated with the production. To give you an idea, if you produce hydrogen from coal gasification, for every kilogram every ton of hydrogen, you produce about 20 tons of CO2. If you use steam gas reforming, so starting from natural gas without carbon capture and sequestration, you are about 11. But if you use renewable electricity and in a process, electrochemical process that is basically water splitting, you split a molecule of water into hydrogen and oxygen, emission is no emissions. And so this hydrogen that we call green or renewable hydrogen, in Europe it's about colors, in the US it's more about carbon intensity, but green hydrogen has the potential to decarbonize a lot of sectors, including hard-to-abate sectors where electrification together with decarbonized electricity production might not be the preferred choice from a technological point of view. So this is why hydrogen, so you can think about decarbonizing refining, you can think about decarbonizing ammonia production in the short terms, but people are talking about using green hydrogen in steel making because you use hydrogen as a reducing agent, but you could also imagine using hydrogen to produce electricity or heat. When you burn hydrogen in a fuel cell, all you produce is electricity, heat, and water. So that's why the environmental value of hydrogen it's high.
Well, the European Union has just come out with this framework called CBAM, right? Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which basically will not force you, but encourage you to decarbonize, right? Anytime we want to export anything, goods or services, or mostly goods, aluminum, steel, fertilizer, hydrogen, and into the European Union, it's going to be effective in January of 2026. But my question is a fewfold. First is, what has made it so slow for hydrogen to scale?
I would argue that it hasn't scaled yet, but
trying to be diplomatic here. But why has it not scaled as quickly as humanity would have wanted to? And I mean, I'm a layperson here. You talk about water. It sounds pretty easy, right, to just split the H from the O.
not that easy.
I mean, I'm sure there's smart scientists out there that could figure out a less costly way of splitting up the atoms.
So today the main cost of hydrogen is actually the fuel source. So it's either the electricity or the fossil fuels that you use to produce it. If you have fossil fuels and then you have to add carbon capture and sequestration, you would have the cost of that too. And then, only then, you basically have CapEx and OpEx. So up to now, it's been an issue of cost, because the truth is that up to now, the world has been hungry for cheap energy, and if you have cheap energy without considering the environmental cost of this cheap energy, then you're only seeing part of the picture, and eventually you need to address also the externalities, and I mean the CO2 emissions that you have when you use fossil fuels. But it's I think it's a economic reality. People have always been happier to buy energy at the cheapest price possible.
Yeah. At the moment, coal is cheap.
But again, it's just because you are not factoring in the effects on climate change, and so you might not pay it now. You will pay it eventually, and so
it's a deferred cost.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so why not buying an insurance now?
The future for the convenience of today, right, in the present. But unfortunately, a lot of people in the developing economies can't think like that, because of the priorities to put food on the table.
Yeah, as you said, the moment when you have to feed your children and you don't even have access to electricity, what you burn to cook your food or to make your water drinkable is not your priority.
Well, I'll give you some picture about Southeast Asia. Well, at the moment, it's collectively electrified to the extent of slightly less than 1 terawatt. And if every Asian country wants to be or needs to be or must be electrified at a rate of at least 6,000 kilowatt, needs to build an additional terawatt, which means we're going to need at least $2 trillion. Give and take a few dollars. We don't have that kind of money, right? So it goes back to your earlier point, and you've alluded to this in, public domains in the past, where I think there needs to be a conversation at least and a collaboration between those that have the technological wherewithal and economic wherewithal with those that need the technological wherewithal and economic wherewithal. How do you foresee the future where this thing could actually come to fruition and could get fertilized a little bit better than what we might have seen in the last decade or two?
I would say it's actually even a little more complex, because I think that in order to be successful, there needs to be a much closer conversation and partnership between the private and public sector. And I'll tell you why I think this is the case. On average, when we have seen in the past new energy infrastructure being deployed, 80% of the cost has been covered by the private sector. The private sector, especially large companies, work in 70, 80 different countries. So they have a global scale that policymakers in single countries don't have. Now, so the first part of my answer is that the public and private sector will need to work much closer than they're doing today. The second one is, it won't come as a surprise, I think that technology innovation is going to be key. We have seen how technology in the past have helped to scale new innovation. Has helped to scale new technologies, bringing down the cost. Again, today a lot of people say green hydrogen is very expensive, but the cost by itself doesn't mean much, because those people never talk about what is the cost of doing nothing. And secondly, they forget that, again, we're talking about hydrogen today because renewables, for which people were saying the same thing in 2000, they're too expensive, they will never be successful, became non-expensive. And to address as I mentioned before, the issues related to intermittency, hydrogen became a solution, a possible solution. So public-private partnership innovation, and I think finding mechanism to finance technology deployment, but the best technology. So the global north should provide not only financing but also access to best technologies available, so that countries in the global south could leapfrog dependence on fossil fuels and on carbon-intensive economies, because they're given access to capital to deploy the best technologies available.
I'm with you in the sense that the private enterprises actually have a much better understanding of the pulse, and I think they can have greater velocity in moving forward than policy, right? And I'm also with you in the sense that I'm actually in the camp that believes that the technological capital deployment is the easier part. It's available, but it's the economic capital deployment that's problematic. That needs to go from this place to the other. There's a lot of concerns in this camp with respect to whether or not they're going to be able to get their money back, right? And I think there's a way to structure this thing, at least conversationally, right? And then you can frame it, as a product that could be held to account, for both parties. Your views on this?
Again, we buy car insurance not because we want to crash our cars, but
Absolutely.
So why shouldn't we be willing to pay for quote unquote climate change insurance that would allow to address what you're saying?
You can think out a product to help bridge where this thing can be availed. Call it 15 cents and call it 5 cents here. This will go up to 6, 7, 8. Who knows when? This will come down to 14, 13, 12. This might come down faster than this thing going up. And then until such time that they interact. That intersection, I think, is the point until which you can create a product to cover whatever risk exposure either, if not both sides, are exposed to.
Also because eventually a growing number of the world population will feel the effects of climate change.
Absolutely.
And is prevention better than having to cure a disease when it has exploded? All the health insurance I should not call it a business, but it's about preventing.
Yeah.
And again, the thing that I never understand is you cannot just be concerned about the cost that you have in front of you. There is also the cost that you have for not doing things, for not addressing climate change. And that cost is a cost that eventually you will have to pay.
Look, I'm with you in the sense that there's not enough of a political culture at the household level, at the social institutions level, in the offices, in schools, that promote conversations along the lines of prevention as opposed to remedy, right? I sense that, particularly with respect to the young generation. I don't think they see it. There's not enough of a political culture to sense that deferred cost that's significant. But at the same time, one would argue that it's actually not that difficult to re-engineer or to re-architect somebody's behavior to be more environmentally friendly as long as the alternatives are affordable.
I think that, and I mean, to your point, the younger generation feel, and they're correct, that they are left with a bad inheritance, and so they're right in saying that it's not their fault. But at the same time, it goes to your comment about behaviors. Again, using mobile phone as an example. My first mobile phone was a Nokia. I would charge my Nokia once a week. Now, with these smartphones, and again, not my generation, so I'm not being blamed for that. You have to charge them every day. I mean, that's energy that you're using. So, again, we should stop to try to assign blame. The past is the past. We cannot change it. We should start talking about how, going forward from now, we can optimize our behaviors, optimize energy system, the balance between the global north and the global south in a way that we think at Earth as a planet and not as every single country or company or family thinking for themselves.
I'm with you,
but it's just on this. I understand.
But there's got to be some realism here. At the rate that the world is becoming siloed, right, and polarization of conversations is so pervasive in every corner of the country, the province, the village, the city, you name it, man. But this takes us to the next question, right? I mean, when you had your Nokia in the 90s, it didn't have internet capabilities. So the requirement for energy was not as much. So the requirement to charge it or recharge it was not as much as it is today.
I actually had to go to the library to look at references for my thesis. Now I can do everything from my office.
No, but if you take a look at the planet, right, it's probably electrified to the extent of 7 or 8 terawatt, right? And if you want everybody to be modern, it probably needs to go up to about 16 to 20 terawatt. This is before AI, right? If you add on to that, listening to the Jensen Huangs of the world, where the latest GPU requires multiples of wattage of electrification, then if everybody of the 190 or 200 countries wants to AI to the extent that perhaps the United States and China would like to, oh my gosh, then the terawattage for the planet, we're looking at 25 to 30 terawatt. Then how do you energize this?
So because you said that I'm in token, since I do consult a lot with companies and governments, let me try to give you the practical.
Okay.
So the low-hanging fruit is energy efficiency. There is so much that we can do there. Why we're not doing it baffles me. We should do it. Or, let me put it in a more diplomatic way, we're not doing enough. We should do more. 2, we really need to optimize energy system based on the underlying resource availability and market dynamics. So, if we don't care about the rest of the world, then okay, do it at a country level. But if you think that you're going to be a member of a global community, we need to start to have conversation. How do we make this system working at global scale, not just in regions or countries? I'll give you an example. We finished a study for the European Union on the future of green hydrogen, and we looked at different scenarios and what it meant in these 3 different scenarios to adopt a green hydrogen at scale, and what the cost would have been. So if I remember well, if we optimize, so we have developed a mathematical model that optimizes fluxes between hydrogen trades between countries. If we optimize in the most efficient way, the cost by 2050 for the European Union to deploy energy market at scale, hydrogen market at scale, so, and by this I mean 10 to 15% of primary energy demand covered by green hydrogen, it will cost 2.3 trillion for the infrastructure. If the single member states were to approach this in a non-cohesive way, it would be from 2 to 3 times more expensive. And I think I should not have to add anything else. Now, sadly, what is happening right now? Every member state is going on its own.
Let me guess. Wow.
Sorry, guys.
Wow. Okay. Nicola, this is the next, topic that I want to explore with you. Nuclear. Right? I just kind of think that this is something that could be the solution for many people around the planet, because it's clean, it's scalable. It might be expensive, but if you amortize it correctly or properly, from an accounting and economic standpoint, it works out. Right? And it's this sheer inability to take the long view sometimes that makes stuff like this disappear in conversations. Of course, there's that geopolitical calculus, right? I want to seek your wisdom on this.
So, as a technologist, I can just say that nuclear has always has never been able to play on a level field, because it's probably the true example of how, if you don't assess a technology on its merits, but on geopolitical non-proliferation issues, so issues that don't have anything to do with the technology itself. What do we do with the waste? Do we reprocess? Do we not? You're not looking at the technology per se. You're looking at the technology with a lot of other, how can I say, hurdles that you put there, but they have nothing to do with the technology. So the technology has to be safe, has to be scalable, but again, I think that nuclear, like every other technology, will need to play a role. We are not in a situation where we can pick and choose. We need to use everything that we have at our disposal. So nuclear, for a series of reasons and application, in my opinion, makes total sense. Now, safety needs to be addressed. The geopolitical aspects, yes, but let's be blunt here. It's not that if people want to build nuclear weapons, they're not going to build them if we don't build nuclear plants. And then, in my experience, it's always better to be part of the conversation than try to pretend that the conversation is not happening. Because if you're not part of the conversation, you cannot influence the outcome.
Now you can actually modularize it,
Yes.
right, with SMR capabilities. And fortunately or luckily, it's surfacing to conversations in more parts of Asia, right? It's not just the Chinese. They're talking about it, doing it, but now I think the Japanese, the Koreans, even I think the Singaporeans, they're tinkering with this idea, at the rate that perhaps from a geopolitical standpoint, there's greater exposure to risk, in terms of what could happen in the South China Sea, in terms of how the Chinese might, energize their presence out there. But just for humanity's sake, this is something that you can actually build incrementally so that you can actually be more sensitive to safety issues, geopolitical issues, and what, right?
Or you could argue that if they're smaller, they're more risky. But
I think the end game is that this is clean, and from a safety standpoint, you could account for it a lot better than perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago. And if you take a look at the number of casualties from nuclear as opposed to fossil, I think I would argue that it's a lot less, with nuclear than it would have been with fossil.
So from a technology point of view, energy density is key. Why are we using fossil fuels? Because they have a very high energy density compared to renewables. They're easy to store, they're easy to transport. So nuclear has the same level of energy density. Then one of the challenges of hydrogen is that hydrogen from a mass point of view has one of the highest energy density, but in volume it's pretty low. So being able to have high energy density, it's important. And so nuclear helps on this. Now, one of the challenges that the nuclear industry, and here at Harvard there are people that can talk about this much better than I can, but is that we have lost over time the supply chain for building new nuclear plants. One of the value proposition that people mention about small modular reactors is that you're going to substitute economy of scale with economies of mass production. The truth is that last time I counted, there were at least 50 different designs for small modular reactors. There is no chance that 50 different designs will be approved to be built, and it will be against the logic of economies of mass production. The truth is that today, because of the lack of a supply chain of the needed skills to build new nuclear plants, small modular reactors sometimes can cost as much as a big one. So the value proposition is that if they're smaller, they're modular, you can even imagine to move them if you have to. But again, in the case of nuclear, the supply chain needs to be developed. In order to develop the supply chain, we need clear rules on how to deal with nuclear, how to deal with the nuclear waste. And I don't think we're there yet.
When do you smell the inflection to take place?
When people realize that we don't have any more time to lose.
Is that within our lifetime?
And I hope so.
Okay.
One of the reasons why I'm here is because I want to try to drive this change.
I want to go back to the AI part of our conversation. If we take a look at AI, I think most of the value proposition is going to accrue to the US and China, right? And we're in Southeast Asia. We've been selling a lot of coal to many parts of the world, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Indians, some other parts of Southeast Asia. At the rate that China is going to, invest on AI, I just can't see how coal is going to disappear in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Until and unless you smell that inflection point taking place sooner. Inflection being defined by our ability to actually scale, renewables.
So, with the caveat that I'm not an expert in AI, I'll try to give an example. This same consideration were made about blockchain. Blockchain, which a lot of people conflate with cryptocurrency, but if we look at the technology itself, it started with, I think it was proof of work, and then it moved to proof of stake.
Right.
The energy consumption of the two is usually different. Proof of work is extremely energy intensive. Proof of stake, it's much less energy intensive. But I started to look into blockchain and the applications of blockchain to energy system, because again, to the point that I was making before about efficiency and being, the low-hanging fruit. And so the questions that my team and my students we asked ourselves was: could blockchain make energy system more efficient? Could the fact that it's an immutable decentralized ledger, could it help? I mean, think about it. Decentralized renewables are decentralized, so we start to think where there could be some connection. We looked at the different application of blockchain to energy. We did not get into the technology itself. I actually was lucky enough because there is a colleague of mine, Silvio Micali, who won the Turing Award for computer science. He has actually developed a proof of stake blockchain. He's at MIT, and he has helped me a lot to understand these dynamics. So, but our point was, what would blockchain need to deliver in order to be applied at the energy system? We identified 8 different applications. I'll tell you the ones that I think are in a way longer term, but excite me. Because if we could do it, it might make a difference. So the first one is what we call energy for all. One of the challenge today, if you want to deploy renewables, let's say a power plant in the global south, is that you might not have access to a grid, and you need financing. So one of the value proposition, and again, I'm not the expert in the technology, is that with the blockchain you can tokenize. So what about if we think about a new way of financing, where instead of having to find people that finance your plant for 1 billion, you tokenize it down to whatever you want, and you ask people to buy this token. Second, because blockchain allows what are called the smart contracts, where basically you don't have to have a central authority, you can have a peer-to-peer transaction. Well, you will not need a grid. If you have an area where there are enough clients or people that need the energy, you could sell them energy through blockchain, and you would have these contracts that would be automatic, and so you could deploy energy in places where you cannot today. The second one that I particularly like is is this, and that's why I've been called down to DC many times. How are you going to certify the molecule is green? Or how are you going to certify that the molecule has a certain carbon content? I mean, today you do it with certificate of origin. Then when you have to have cross-border adjustment is crazy. Certificate of origin cross-border means that you have to go to the custom officer of the exporting country and give a pile of paper. The same pile of paper has to be given by someone else to the importing country. You have double counting. So imagine if one of the value proposition could be delivered, of blockchain could be delivered, where you could certify and put them on chain and not, no one can tamper with them. You would have solved a huge problem.
More transparency, more accountability, more real-time usage.
Yes.
Better democratization of energy.
Yes. With the beauty that the regulator could have access. So when you think about blockchain, there is a public part, but you could have also part that is not public. Because imagine if you have, when I talk about with companies about this private corporation, about this, the challenge is that we don't want to put our own commercial know-how in the public domain. Well, you could imagine that you have a part of the chain that it's only open to whoever you want. And then you have a part that is open to regulator, is open to customers. And so this is why I've been looking into blockchain.
Interesting. Do you see this as something that's hopeful? Or more hopeful than others?
So if the technology can deliver what proponents say could, and we made a list of 7 things or 7 characteristics that needs to be met for blockchain to be applied in the energy sector. Yes, because it really addresses. There are a lot of overlaps. So right now, I don't know where, in which country in Europe there is a news company that has this sort of blog or whatever it's called. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's the AI that we like. So they try to highlight where AI could make a difference. So going back to the point that I made before, technologies are not bad or good by themselves. It's the use that you make of the technology that makes the difference. Not every technology can be used anywhere. But if we are able to find, and we need to find, how and where the different technology fit best, we could make a big difference.
Just to pick up on this democratization of energy, I mean, there's been some thought or observation about how solar could help with respect to the democratization of energy, right? Are you in the camp that believes that that's going to happen?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
And guess what? I'll use hydrogen again. So, from a geopolitical point of view, since I think the late 90s, one of the reasons why people saw value in renewables was exactly what you said, that you could democratize energy production because every country has access to solar and wind. My point is at different costs, though. So one of the first questions that we try to address in our work on hydrogen, we look both at supply and demand, so application, but also how you could produce it. Is it true that adoption of green hydrogen scale would make the energy world more democratized? And so we did, as I mentioned before, we did the study on the European Union about this. We have done it for India. We're finishing one for in the US to look at competition or collaboration between states in hydrogen production. But the geopolitical realities of a renewable world or a hydrogen world are they're going to be different, but dependency will still exist. So if we look at the European Union from a purely cost point of view, Morocco, if we assume shipping by ammonia, would actually, from a cost point of view, be able to supply 40% or more of the demand of the European Union. So what's the difference though? Is that we know this today. So if we look at what adoption of a technology in the future will imply in terms of energy security, energy independence, cost, we can try to optimize much better than what we've done in the past. So is the European Union willing to depend from Morocco for 40% of its hydrogen demand? If not, what can the European Union do today to address this? And setting up energy system optimized from the beginning is much less expensive than having to fix them afterwards. Again, the example of natural gas in Russia is the typical one. So the European Union can start to think, would it make sense for me to start to discuss today with the United States or India to have an export of hydrogen to the green hydrogen to the European Union, so that I don't depend on one country for 40%? And I'm not making a merit evaluation on the dependence on Morocco. I'm actually going, as I told you, to Morocco soon. Yeah. So I'm just stating, do we want to do this? Now, these are choices that policymakers need to make. It's not something that you can leave to a company. I actually would argue that you really don't want a private company to decide policies for you.
Yeah. But, at the moment, we're kind of exposed, right, to these silos. And what you're suggesting is some sort of a collaborative effort between Morocco and the EU.
Which is really,
it's happening, but the big picture, it depends on the geopolitical calculus, right? So
one of the issues of the European Union is that it's called a union, but for a lot of things, it's not a union.
that's a separate discussion.
No, but and I don't want to go there. I'm a chemical engineer. I'm happy to talk about technology. If you force me, I'll talk about politics.
Yeah. Okay, this is going to be my second last question. I want to go back to that democratization of energy, and I'm going to use solar because it's simpler. I mean, to the extent that you believe that it could help democratize, what would happen to the pre-existing grid from a value proposition standpoint? It could plummet, right? I mean, if some villager in some country could just solarize himself or herself without having to rely on the pre-existing grid. If you take a look at the balance sheets of most utilities companies, the asset side, it's mainly the grid.
Yes.
And so is the liability side.
But then again, if we are going to decentralized energy production, it's not that grids will disappear for certain...
Centralistic, but of decentralistic.
No, but I mean, this is a transition that will need to, even incumbents, grid operators will need to accept. Right. Because again, if we're saying that we're not going to deploy solar where you can deploy it because there are space issues and all, resource availability and all that. If we're going to say that we're not going to do it because otherwise the value of someone else, and I would argue that the value for them would not be impacted because they're so ingrained in the energy system today that in large city, I don't see how you can go off grid. But So, with the caveat that I don't think that they would lose their value of their assets, I would argue that is not a constraint that we can consider.
Got it. Last one. AC Milan or Inter Milan?
So my former boss.
That's a difficult question.
No, it's very easy. My former boss is now the president of Milan AC. So I think since I like the guy a lot,
But the operative word being former.
yeah, but as I said, I like the guy a lot. So I'll say Milan AC. I actually, being in the US, I'm lucky enough I don't have to actually choose. I'll watch whatever I can see on TV, which on US TV is very little.
Are they going to win?
I don't know. What I learned about Italian football is that you can never tell.
On that note,
Thank you for having me.
Nicola, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was Nicola de Blasio, Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center, Harvard University. Thank you.
Inilah Endgame.